Hello everyone and welcome to this tutorial for the AQA Power and Conflict Poetry Cluster. Tutorial 12 is on War Photographer by Carol Duffy. This is my favourite poem, so I'm really excited today to be able to share this with you. You'll need your AQA anthology and 3 different coloured highlighters. If you're new to the tutorials, then all you need to know is you'll watch a video of me annotating the poem. Today I will be narrating over the top, of course. How could I not? I love to talk about this poem. Do try not to skip through, just because sometimes I do say things that I don't necessarily write down that could be useful. It's just because we don't have that much space to write all the time. We'll then look at the poem in its entirety. I'll pose some questions to you that I highly recommend you answer in order to ensure and solidify your understanding and engagement with this poem. So without further ado, it's time to annotate.
You're everything that I see. I want your heart, love, and emotion endlessly. I can't get over you. You put your mark on me. I want your heart, love, and emotion endlessly. Cause you're a good girl and you know it. You act so different around me. Cause you're a good girl and you know it. I know exactly who you could be. Oh, just hold on, we're going home. Just hold on, we're going home. It's hard to do these things alone. Just hold on, we're going home. Yeah, I got my eyes on you. You're everything that I see. I want your heart, love, and emotion endlessly. I can't get over you. You left your mark on me. I want your heart, love, and emotion endlessly. Cause you're a good girl and you know it. You act so different around me. Cause you're a good girl and you know it. I know exactly who you could be. Just hold on, we're going home. Just hold on, we're going home. It's hard to do these things alone. Just hold on, we're going home. Yeah. You're the girl, you're the one. I give you everything I love. You think that's something, baby? You think that's something, baby? You're the girl, you're the one. I give you everything I love. You think that's something, baby? You think that's something? Just hold on, we're going home. Just hold on, we're going home. It's hard to do these things alone. Just hold on, we're going home. Yeah. Just hold on, we're going home. 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 I know.
Okay, so just at the top here, I'm just writing the key themes. So lasting impact of war, desensitization and futility, and power of memory. And I'm just going to write a little structural note here. The regular stanzas and couplets contrast the chaos of war, as if the war photographer is trying to process reality. So, little things to know. Carol Duffy, poet laureate, she was inspired by her friendship with a war photographer. And the job that they have to do. And actually, when you consider that job, it's a little bit insane, which we'll talk about a little bit more. she has an affinity with this profession because essentially what a photographer does, a war photographer does, is use their medium, which is photography, her medium being poetry, and uses it to expose the truth and reality of the world. So she has that affinity with a war photographer because she, I suppose, sees that she does the same kind of thing. War photographer is written in third person omniscient voice. So Carol Ann Duffy has not embodied the war photographer. She's writing about him as an observer. So let's get stuck in. So first of all, the tone. In his dark room, he is finally alone. It opens here with a sense of relief, but potentially even exhaustion. In his dark room, he is finally. It's that adverb finally that makes us think that. And then we have the word darkroom. And this is an ambiguous word, and you'll have a lot of ambiguous imagery in this poem. So first of all, the denotation, it is what it is. A darkroom is a place where a photographer develops their photos. However, a dark room could be seen as symbolic of being in a bad place, both physically and emotionally. We then have this spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. Spools are actually the circular contraption that photography film is wound around. So spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. I suppose, first of all, what we have here is the sibilance. Spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. And it gives it a hushed tone, which is quite odd because he's in a war zone. So there's this juxtaposition, it juxtaposes war. And we get this real sense of disconnect throughout the poem between the photographer and the war, and you'll see why by the end. It's also symbolic of trying to make sense of war, the fact that he's putting them in ordered rows, these spools. Again, not much order in war, there's lots of chaos, but he's putting them in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows. Again, we have this ambiguous imagery because, again, the denotation, the infrared light is used in a dark room to help develop photographs. But also, the only light is red. So if we see that as symbolic light being of hope, the only light is red. So it's symbolic of all the blood that's been shed or been seen. We then go into line 4 and 5, as though this were a church and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. This is a simile, but also religious imagery. And what it does here essentially is put him as the priest preparing to intone a mass. So his congregation, which obviously in real life would be people, is actually photos. So he has a congregation of photos. And these photos are likely to be of death because he's in a war zone. So the mass is actually a funeral. He's intoning a funeral almost. He's lining up these people who have died. I love this line 6. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. What Duffy does here is name 3 places that are war zones from history. And there's the caesura, the full stop, Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh. I'm just going to pause myself. And essentially what is happening here is that Duffy makes it blunt, almost as if it's a disgust or despair with essentially the fact that there's just so much war, that this war that we're talking about, that this photographer is photographing, it's an unnamed war, but it's certainly not Belfast, Beirut or Phnom Penh because they're being listed as wars of history. We then have this biblical image of all flesh is grass. It's a biblical allusion here. All flesh is grass comes from, I think, the New Testament, might be the Old Testament. Anyway, and essentially translates to human life is transitory. And that's a real sort of throwaway comment. It's suggesting, well, death is death and life happens. But it's quite blunt again. So it's not meant to be literal. It's almost to provoke. It's a provocative image. So I'm just going to go through and highlight my favourite thing to do. It's really interesting because essentially what Duffy does throughout this poem is to look at the futility in a really different way. And remember, this is a completely different perspective once again in our war cluster that we have, because Duffy herself hasn't been in war and certainly isn't a war photographer. So we're seeing a completely different perspective again, but the similar messages will come through. So stanza 2 then, he has a job to do. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands. So what we have, first of all, there is sibilance again, so that hushed tone. I won't write that down again though. But we have an ambiguous image. So solutions slop in trays beneath his hands. When you develop photos, you put a developing solution in a tray and paper in, and you sort of slop it around. However, solution, as in a solution to something, slopping trays beneath his hands, it's almost like a metaphor for the careless attempt or for peace. So the fact that it's sloppy, the solutions that people come up with, because nobody really ends war because we're so detached from it. I've just realised there, he has a job to do. This is a really, when you consider the emotion that we get from the war photographer, this is quite cold and emotionless, and it's disconnected really, which is, it juxtaposes that the feelings of the war photographer, because it's almost, in reality, he's just got to get on with it, which is this really sad truth about war, that people just get on with it. We then have this rural England right in the middle of a line, in between two full stops. Rural England is an idyllic image. This is the countryside. And it's interesting that this is what's mentioned because it's symbolic of safety, but it's that caesura here, the fact that it's just on its own. That caesura emphasizes the disconnect between where the war photographer is and these countries that have war, and then this idyllic, perfect image of rural England. So the caesura emphasizes the disconnect because rural England as a phrase is disconnected in the line. Then it says, home again to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel. This is a real cynical tone here, because essentially what Duffy is suggesting is that she's highlighting the lack of understanding that we at home have. Home again to ordinary pain. She calls our pain ordinary, and she says that simple weather can dispel our pain. So we're all quite guilty of that, I suppose. We engage so much with our own lives and not the lives of others. So the sun comes out and we feel better again, is essentially what she's saying there. And then this juxtaposition to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat, which again brings us back to the war zone. So we've got this emotive image of children running. I think that this is potentially also a nod to the Vietnam War. There's a really famous photo of children running after a napalm bomb. It's a really powerful image. If you get a chance to look at it, it's really worth it, because it was the picture that said would end all wars, and obviously it really didn't. So there's this violent nature of war and then the innocence of children. So there's a juxtaposition within the image itself, but then you have the juxtaposition from line 9, rural England, this idyllic imagery, and then this nightmare heat and an explosion beneath feet in fields, you know. So it highlights the inequality and the reality of war zones. It's a really powerful image. So we definitely get this cynical, bitter tone from Duffy throughout. And I think that is her voice, even though she is not a character or speaker in this poem directly. So on to stanza 3. Something is happening, a stranger's features. So initially we get this tonal shift, something is happening. And I think that replicates what life must have been like for the war photographer anyway. Remember, a war photographer is armed with a camera. So he's still in amongst the combat, but does not have a weapon. He has a camera. And how frightening that must be, and how he must feel on edge all the time. So even though this is actually just talking about the picture developing, it makes it sound dramatic and suspenseful. We then have this image, a stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, and we have ambiguous imagery again. So on the one hand, the photo's developing. So it is a stranger because he would be taking pictures of people he doesn't know. And it faintly starts to twist before his eyes. It's like the picture is forming. However, this picture could be of somebody dying. So that stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes could actually be a memory of what he took a picture of, like a person writhing in pain. Really, really powerful here. It's that word twist before his eyes. And this is where it becomes a bit blurred. This ambiguity that Duffy uses is almost suggesting that, that is it memory or is it photographs or is it both? It's really interesting. We then have the half-formed ghost, which is ambiguous as well, because again, it does look quite ghostly as a photo develops because it's not all sharp edges. So the denotation would be that the photo is not clear just yet. But on the other hand, if the person is dying, surely they're a half-formed ghost because they're not a full ghost because they're not dead. So you get this image again of death. It's really powerful. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. This is the reality of a war photographer, not knowing the language, how he sought approval without words. He would have had to ask if he could take a picture without actually asking. So in a moment where this wife is cradling her husband and he's dying, he has to ask if he can take a photo. And I think there's a sort of double meaning here because it also highlights that empathy is universal because it's without words. He would have used facial expressions. That would have come from the heart, So then we also have the ambiguity of the idiom. So to have no words, if you have no words for something, it's indescribable. So how he sought approval without words, on the one hand, it's the reality of not knowing the language, but on the other hand, it's the fact that it's indescribable to have to take pictures of people as they die. And then we have this final image in stanza 3, how the blood stained into foreign dust. This is a graphic image and it should resonate with you because of remains. It's this constant reminder. So like the idiom, blood on your hands, it will never go away. That person's death is there forever, stained into the sand. And I actually think that we have a repetition here of the word how. Now, it's not a question, but the preposition how actually makes it seem like it's an interrogative. How he sought approval, how the blood stained into foreign dust, almost as if the war photographer can't understand what's happening. Like, how is it that he was able to do that? It's really, really powerful. What I think as well is you have this conflict again of the war photographer needing to do his job. I've just realised that I've gone on to the next stanza and I need to go back. I'm sure I'll remember in a moment. We're still on stanza 3, really. So, this real sense that he's conflicted because it's his job to take these photos, but what a horrific job to have. And the whole point of this, and you must get this from the poem, is that if we are seeing what he is seeing, how do we not stop war? How do we not feel the reality of it? And I think this is really current with things that are going on in the world right now. The fact that we can record everything on our phones. So really take that in. The final stanza is incredibly powerful. 100 agonies in black and white. The in black and white is ambiguous because the colour of the photos could be in black and white. But the idiom, when something is in black and white, is to see things clearly as right and wrong. There's no argument. It's either black or white. There's no grey area. Now, we don't live in society like that anymore, but the idiom is there. So you have this ambiguity because essentially what he's saying is with the emotive imagery of 100 agonies in black and white, there's no argument with the fact that he has 100 photos of death and destruction and tragedy. You can't escape that. There's no counter argument. And then the next line, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. So this would be in almost the entertainment section of a newspaper. And you've got this juxtaposition between the numbers, 100 and 5 or 6. So he takes 100, he witnesses 100 tragedies, and 5 or 6 of those photos get selected. Because essentially there's a deliberate contrast here in the numbers because Duffy's highlighting the lack of care, but also that war's seen as entertainment. I'll pick the 5 or 6 that sell more newspapers. People are profiting from war. And there's a real anger in the tone here. It gets even more angry. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. So we read the newspaper and our eyes prick with tears. This is a tone of criticism because between the bath and pre-lunch beers, so between those two things, we suddenly, our lives go back to normal. We snap back to reality. Oh, a little bit Eminem there. You've got the internal rhyme of tears and beers done on purpose because it highlights how quickly we go back to normal. Tears become beers on the same line. From the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns a living and they do not care. To be impassive is to have no feeling towards. So he looks at this place now with no feeling, as if war has taken the emotion away from him. And this final line, it's so condemning to us with absolute damnation. It's a tone of accusation and anger that all that pain is evidenced in his photographs. And there is no change. It's that futility of war. Essentially, Duffy is encapsulating the fact that we are desensitized. When you're desensitized to something, it is when you become used to it. You're not shocked by it anymore. And unfortunately, what she accuses society of being is desensitized to war. And she's not wrong, because we do see pictures of war all the time. Even in 2020, we see war still, and it's not stopping. And that's the point. So I'm just going to write a couple of other features down here. I want to talk about the ambiguous imagery, but also hopefully you notice that there is enjambment. Now, the enjambment works in two ways, I suppose. You have, on the one hand, this flow of memory and emotion from the war photographer himself. And enjambment does that quite well. When you look at where the enjambment occurs, it's almost as if it's spilling out of him. But also, enjambment, as we've seen in other poems, enhances that fact that war goes on. It continues. And there's nothing you can do about it. Despite all of the tragedy, war still goes on. So even when the description is graphic and horrible and unimaginable, the enjambment makes the poem continue. It pushes it forward. But this ambiguous imagery, honestly, is so powerful and so clever. Because the denotation of photography imagery it's all very simple imagery that you would associate with a photographer. So she's right to do it because it's about a war photographer. It's blended then with this symbolic and metaphorical imagery as well. Every time the photography imagery is mentioned, you can interpret something deeper. And so I think that the connotations highlight our need to think more deeply. Don't just look at a photo of war and accept it. Look at a photo of war and think about it and feel it. It's the importance of the war photographer's job and our need to think more deeply about that job. And it's so, so relevant still, sadly. And that is us done. So hopefully you have a poem that looks like that. Okay, so here's our poem. So this story essentially follows a war photographer who gets back to his darkroom where he develops his photos and essentially starts to process his day, I think is what it is. But we get so much more than that, because we do get what we assume to be Duffy's voice and tone come through the character of the war photographer, but also we have the character of the stranger and his wife as well, sort of focalized through them. This is that omniscient voice. Remember, omniscient, all seeing. We see everything. We don't just see the war photographer in his dark room. And the story is essentially about this processing of these hundreds of photos that he's taken, and the day that he's had where he's taken photos of people dying and in pain. But that's his job and that's what he has to do. And I will go back to the fact that just consider the job of a war photographer, because it's a powerful job to write about. You can understand why Duffy picked it, not just because of her friend, but how fascinating to be on a battlefield armed with a camera. So you're still in that dangerous situation. So even though our war photographer is not one of the Light Brigade and not in World War I freezing to death in the trenches, our war photographer is on a battlefield. Our war photographer experiences what Armitage's character would have experienced in the Iraq War, but no training in combat, no weapon to protect, and actually must go towards the danger because that's where the good pictures are. And it's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it is, as they say, this Sunday supplement. As Duffy says, the editor then selects the best photos, the most eye-catching. We know newspapers, we know this is what they do. News isn't necessarily pure fact. The media must, in order to earn money, ensure that we buy their product. It's still consumerism. Oh, you're getting me now. I'm going down off on a tangent. I could talk about this poem all day. But hopefully you're getting a sense of this. It's bonkers because there are people dying and there is a person with a camera in their face. But the flip side is that double edge is that, but isn't that necessary for the war photographer to have purpose? Surely in that affinity, using their medium to expose truth and reality, that's what they have to do. So that's why sometimes throughout you get this, he has a job to do, very sort of blunt tones. There's definite aggression that escalates throughout. I believe that to be Duffy's aggression as opposed to the war photographer's, because by the end, the war photographer stares impassively out of the window, as if he's numbed by it all. But I think Duffy is outraged on behalf of the war photographer, because I think she thinks we should be. And that really goes with our theme, this lasting impact of war. So you have the lasting impact on the war photographer, but also this idea of immortalizing war through photography. those photos exist forever. Like I said, if you ever get a chance to, it's not a pleasant thing to do, but sometimes it's really helpful to your understanding of what Duffy's message is here about this desensitization. Photographs of war, yes, are to expose truth and reality of it. Why expose that truth and reality? Because essentially it's an aim to stop it. And it doesn't stop, and it hasn't stopped. So that desensitization and futility of war, what's the point of it all? And potentially, what's the point in trying to expose it, because that doesn't change anything. There's a real element of defeat and bitterness and sadness in this poem. On the flip side, on a completely different tangent, you also could use this as the power of memory and how powerful our memories are and how they affect us. So you could detach this completely from war, in the sense that rather than making a comment on war, it's making a comment on the power of our memories. However, I think you'll agree with me that this functions really nicely as a war poem, and it's a completely different perspective. We're getting some really nice perspectives in these poems. I've gone over the message quite a few times, but just in case you missed it, the key message here is that back at home, we are desensitized to war, and we lack an understanding and an engagement with war, and that there are many people trying to make things better, but actually nothing ever stops war. War is this powerful entity. It's a poisonous creature, and it's unstoppable. You know, I think that's a real sort of sad truth, is that right now, even, war feels unstoppable. There's always a threat of war. War is always lurking around the corner. So I think that's what she's saying, but I think that the kind of key message is that we need to. It's a call to arms. It's an ask of her reader to think more deeply and stop being so desensitized. Okay, let's move on to the questions. So question 1, what is effective about the ambiguous imagery used throughout, in your opinion? Question 2, how does the structure of the poem enhance meaning? Question 3, why does Duffy use juxtaposition in the second stanza? Question 4, what is Duffy telling us about war? And question 5, how does this poem link with the theme of memory?